And now, all the way from America, it's time for the Tea Party Power Hour with everyone's favourite Yank, Mark Gillar.
Welcome to the Tea Party Power Hour. My name is Mark Gillar. My first guest this morning is Mr. Clais Ryn. He is the author of many books and has for 35 years been the co-editor of Humanitas. Claes is here today to talk to us about his brand new book, The Failure of American Conservatism and the Road Not Taken. Claes, welcome to the show.
Pleasure to be with you.
Now, I have to admit, the title of the book is a bit depressing. The Failure of American Conservatism. Has American conservatism really failed, and if so, how?
Well, nothing ever fails absolutely. There's always a chance for a comeback. But by its own standards of success, the so-called American conservative movement has failed. To give you a few specifics, conservative movement that started to emerge in earnest in the early 1950s, wanted to stop the growth of the Leviathan state, as it was called. Totalitarianism had been defeated in Germany, and it was in a standoff in Russia, but in the United States, there was also a sort of progressive mentality that was producing great growth of the central state. And conservatives opposed that general trend. They were also interested in economics, very interested in economics, and they wanted fiscal discipline and free markets. They represented what they considered a Western civilization, which was being undermined, and because it was being undermined, American constitutional liberties were also being undermined. So if you take just those issues, you can see that conservatism has failed. Whether it is entirely to blame for it, it has failed certainly with regard to the Leviathan state. The central state in the United States is larger than ever. As for fiscal discipline, I think that is the last term that anybody would use to describe the financial management of the U.S. government. And if we look at what might be the most important of all subjects, trying to protect what remains of the Western civilization, it has effectively, in our dominant media, in the culture generally, been replaced by cancel culture and woke, which is just about antithetical to traditional classical and Christian culture.
With regard to fiscal responsibility, I heard Phil Gramm speak once, and he said that a Democrat and a Republican will both spend every penny of your tax dollars, then spend money they don't have, and the only difference between the two parties is the next morning the Republican might feel a little more guilty about it. So I wholeheartedly agree with what you're saying with regard to fiscal conservatism. Now, you bring up wokeism. And I note in the book that you state that we shouldn't be surprised that wokeism emerged. Why is that?
Because people who have paid attention to the mind and the imagination in Western societies could see that woke and cancel culture were simply the most recent manifestations of long-standing trends. It's not a matter of saying that America turned in the wrong direction in 1950 or something like that, or just after the war. Certain trends that have undermined the core values of Western civilization have been underway for a couple of centuries, more than a couple of centuries. And we could discuss in detail what that was about, but let me try to summarize it very, very briefly. A certain view gained ground starting in the 18th century. It was associated with the philosopher of the French Revolution, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. The French Revolution was in 1789. He argued that all of Western civilization was based on a profound misunderstanding. That understanding had been that human nature is cleft. Human beings have higher and lower potentialities. Christianity talked about original sin and the need for parents, churches, communities to buttress what was highest in human beings. That is to say, the crux of the problem is never external to humanity. It's not external social institutions or external phenomena of any kind. The heart of human problem is that humanity has to somehow contain its self-indulgence, its egotism, its recklessness. We are prone to making huge mistakes. And humanity over the centuries has dealt with that problem by building social institutions, the family in particular, churches, etc. But Rousseau argued that the problems we are facing, inequality, oppression, everything bad, it's due not to some chronic weakness of human nature. It's due to perverse social institutions. And the problem is, or the solution is, to get rid of all that has been inherited, that has been allegedly intended to improve human beings. Sweep it all away. This is the spirit of revolutionary thinking. And the revolution in France was, of course, followed by other revolutions. The Soviet or the Russian Revolution comes to mind, but there are others. The Cuban Revolution, et cetera, et cetera. So cancel culture has been on the agenda for a very long time. Rousseau was the first cancel culturist. So when in America in the 1970s and the late 60s, we had the cancel culture of that time, namely the counterculture, as it was called, or the new left. This was just a variant, a revolutionary, quasi-progressive impulse that had been present for a very long time and that had only grown stronger in time. So this is the reason why nobody who is familiar with history and the evolution of culture should not be surprised by what has happened in recent decades.
It seems to have really become extreme, though, in the last few years. I mean, we have transvestites reading to kindergarten children. We have the governor of Florida having to remove books from school libraries that teach young boys how to perform certain acts on adult men. It really seems to be a situation where they're almost trying to see what they can think of next to offend us. So what do you attribute the extreme nature of some of the things this woke culture is coming up with?
No, I think you're right. The people who are proposing these things, they're testing the limits. And they know that if they can even affect the minds and the imaginations of little children, their chances of destroying whatever remains of traditional civilization go up dramatically. Now, one of the themes of my book is that the movement conservatives failed because they were not sufficiently attentive to these deeper developments within the culture, within the mind and the culture, within entertainment, within the movies, within the publishing industry. This is where the mind and the imagination of people is shaped for the future. That is, if you have control of these institutions, Hollywood is a very good example in the American case, then you manage to insert yourself into the heart of hearts of the growing generation. They start to view the world the way the movie makers view the world. They start humming certain tunes and reciting certain lyrics. They are on board with something that is rather subtle and still very powerful. The failure of American conservatism was that despite some very sound and promising beginnings in the 1950s, the conservative movement became preoccupied with politics and more or less ignored the necessity of trying to transform the culture in the broad sense. We could talk more about what this culture is, but the culture is generally that which gives most people their sense of reality, their sense of what is noble and desirable and what is threatening and evil. If you have control of the mind and the imagination, you have control over the long-term direction of society, including politics. So when movement conservatives stand there like a deer in headlights observing cancel culture, it's because they have failed to put their finger on the pulse and been virtually obsessed with politics. Now, I've been a professor of politics for about 50 years, and so I'm not arguing that politics is unimportant. Of course, it can be crucially important, especially in an emergency situation. But even politics is downstream from culture, as I like to put it. If a certain view of reality has been spread throughout academia, spread to all future teachers and all future journalists and professors and movie makers and so on, that mentality is going to dominate even politics in the long run.
Looking back on things, and hindsight's of course always 20/20, but looking back on things, what could conservatives have done to prevent this from happening, and what can we do going forward to try to correct this?
I have to refer here to a famous quasi-Marxist thinker, Italian, by the name of Antonio Gramsci. We don't need to go deeply into him, except for me to point out that he understood, because of influences working on him, that in order to change society, you have to have what he called a march through the culture. Leftists understood this, that politics is likely to follow whatever has been achieved by way of changing people's sense of reality in the culture. So what conservatives might have done early on, once the conservative movement got underway, is follow the direction or the suggestions of some prominent people, including Russell Kirk, whose 1953 book, The Conservative Mind, made him the father of modern American conservatism. Now, interestingly, he was one to be very sensitive to the influence of the culture, the influence of history, of ideas, the arts, and he wrote many things to show that an important factor if society is to remain healthy is what he called the moral imagination. Now, we don't have the time to go into what that means, but what he was onto, because he was profoundly influenced by a Harvard professor by the name of Irving Babbitt, is that the imagination tends to run our lives. That is, what we imagine as satisfying and elevating, and not what we imagine as scary and to be avoided, sets the tone in our lives and predisposes us to favor this, that, or the other way of living, or this, that, or the other way of voting in politics. So, unfortunately, in the 1950s already, this pseudo-pragmatism that politics is everything more or less took over. Conservatism might have poured all of its, or most of its energies into trying to salvage the culture. They didn't, partly because of one person by the name of William F. Buckley Jr. He started his magazine, National Review, in 1955. It was in many ways an intellectual magazine, a very, I would say, stimulating magazine, but it was clear that although the magazine had many prominent intellectuals connected to it, the whole point seemed to Buckley to be to prepare the ground for political victories. He was even himself attracted to politics. He ran for mayor of New York City. Now, the National Review Circle pretty much laid the groundwork for the Goldwater for President movement in 1964. That failed, of course, but then came the period of Ronald Reagan, and he won great victories. And then the movement conservatives said, oh, conservatism has triumphed. I was very much alive at the time, and I shook my head inwardly because I knew that while Reagan was winning these political victories, America's culture was headed in a completely different direction. Reagan's victories were a kind of fallback to an earlier era, a temporary resurgence of more traditional views. But the time would come when the so-called progressive, revolutionary, liberationist sentiment would expand in academia and elsewhere and transform everything else.
We will be right back with Clais Ryn, the author of The Failure of American Conservatism and the Road Not Taken, right after we do a little business with America.
We all know a guy who only occasionally shaves for big occasions, and it's because that occasional shave really hurts. It's the time of year for big occasions, and yet there he is, suffering with that cheap drugstore razor. Let's help him out. Henson Shaving's line of razors, built with aerospace precision, deliver a smooth shave your dad, brother, and even son can enjoy, eventually. With replacement blades just 10 cents each, you'll buy it once, and they'll use it for life. How's that for the perfect gift? Celebrate with 100 free blades on your first purchase, and no subscription headaches. HensonShaving.com/holiday.
For the ones who get it done, the most important part is the one you need now. And the best partner is the one who can deliver. That's why millions of maintenance and repair pros trust Grainger. Because we have professional-grade supplies for every industry, even hard-to-find products. And we have same-day pickup and next-day delivery on most orders. But most importantly, we have an unwavering commitment to help keep you up and running. Call, click Grainger.com, or just stop by. Grainger, for the ones who get it done.
And we are back with Clais Ryn, the author of The Failure of American Conservatism and the Road Not Taken.
If you can, give me some hope for the future in terms of what conservatives can do moving forward. I mean, looking at the situation, we have lost control of the media, and I don't know that we ever had it, but lost control of academia. We've lost the younger generation. A lot of people would say, should we just throw our hands up, or what can we do moving forward?
No, absolutely not. Absolutely not. There's much to be done. And the larger question is, how can the culture be turned back from the abyss? I mean, the state of America's culture now is atrocious. But having a march through the culture is a matter for the generations. But we all have opportunities where we happen to be. If you are an academic, you try to sort things out intellectually. If you're a parent, you see to it that you oppose what you regard as atrocious in what's happening to your children. You don't attend churches that play along with wokeism, etc. Let me say, this may sound unexpected, that it certainly is not sufficient to say, let's go back to the churches, then everything will be straightened out. That's not a very propitious statement, inasmuch as the churches themselves have become, in large measure, a conveyor belt for woke and cancel culture. A lot of churches are trying to prove that they're not backward or reactionary. They are right on top of things. That is, they're pandering to trends that are ultimately completely destructive of Christianity. Another thing that parents should consider is to break out of this mentality that if only we could get our child into Harvard, Stanford, Duke, whatever, they will be successful in their lives. This is sending them to institutions that, while they have them under their control, will help to transform their minds, possibly destroy their lives. And why are people going to Disney World? Why in the world do they collaborate with what is going on down there. I guess there's also the California side of it. So I'm saying that there are any number of things that the grassroots people can do to change or to do something to change the dynamic. I do have this feeling that when the woke cancel culture crowd started to get into the kindergartens and started to try to influence the way we view sexual matters, they may have gone too far. Now, they only talked to people like themselves, so they thought, oh, everybody is going to be eventually coming along. Not so. I think that now many, many parents are starting to say, what? I'm asked to have my kids attend? What sorts of things are being proposed. I think maybe here the woke cancel culture crowd, this decadent culture, has overreached, and there may be a backlash when the kids are being appropriated. Many parents will say enough.
I think we are seeing that, and of course the woke crowd is mislabeling the parents as being right-wing extremists, and I think the FBI thinks they're dangerous when they speak up at meetings. But I think another example of that overreach might be what happened with Bud Light recently. Finally, a group of people stood up and said, you know what, enough of this. And people now, and of course part of this has to do with Elon Musk purchasing Twitter, but we're starting to see online people coming forward and just saying, no, enough is enough. We're not going to tolerate this. And I guess that's a good beginning. People choosing their principles over money. A good example of that would be, I believe, a podcaster named Joe Walsh was told by YouTube that he had to refer to Dylan Mulvaney by Mulvaney's preferred pronouns, and he said no, and he sacrificed $100,000 a month in revenue by leaving YouTube. But we're starting to see people choose principle over money. We're starting to see people say, I think, I don't care what anyone thinks of me. I'm going to stand by my principles, and you are not going to teach this to my child. You are not going to put this book in the school library. You are not going to enter the classrooms of young children and recruit them to some sort of perversion. So I think you're very much correct in that it's starting to happen. And the question is this going to be a brief blip, or will the rejection of wokeism continue?
Yeah, let me add on that subject that there's one thing that's more important than perhaps anything else, and that is that in order to come up with cures, we first have to have very realistic, uncompromisingly realistic assessment of what the problem is. I think that because conservatives have been so preoccupied with practical politics, raising money and talking about nothing about other than who's going to be the next president and so on, they have been sort of sidetracked from where the real action is for the long-term future. And I think it's going to take a long time probably for conservatives to wean themselves off this Johnny One-Note approach to politics. What is most deeply wrong with American society and Western society in general is a rotting culture, a decadent, rotting culture. And you cannot hope to deal with it effectively by purely political means. You have to think about the nature of the problem, and it would be very foolish to think that you could make up for the neglect of the culture in the last 60, 70 years by having a smashing electoral victory. That's not the way of the world. So uncompromising realism, I think, ought to be the guiding light for people who are attempting to set things right.
As I'm listening to you speak, in my mind, I'm going through all the things that this counterculture has taken over. Call it wokeism, call it whatever you want. But I feel like, it's destroyed the Boy Scouts, the Girl Scouts, female sports, college sports, professional sports. Anything it touches, it seems to destroy. And I, again, think that we're going to have people rise up and just say, no, we're not going to put up with it anymore. And I think you're also very correct in that when they went after the children, that's when parental instincts really kicked in, and they said, okay, I've been putting up with a lot of this, but this is where I draw the line. So, again, Hopefully it's the beginning. Hopefully it's the beginning of a true rejection of this. I graduated college in 1986, and even then, we were already hearing, let everybody do what they want. Don't judge others. Don't judge others. You can't do that. And then I guess 10 years ago, I'm in a college town. I'm speaking to you about 5 miles from Texas A&M University, and you hear the kids saying, "Don't be a hater. Be open-minded. Don't be a hater." And it's as if they're being taught to accept everything. Then I hear things coming out of the WEF where they're trying to both legalize and normalize pedophilia. I never in my life thought I would hear people start referring to child molesters as minor attracted persons, to have a euphemism or to soften it.
Yeah, and think about,
crazy.
There's another dimension of the problems we're facing, and that is that we are being asked to avoid reality, to look away from our problems. We all know about the drugs being everywhere. We know about the condition of the inner cities of the United States. At the same time that certain politicians would like to reduce or to abolish the police. Now, at the same time that social problems galore all around us. What are we doing abroad? We have been taught by a certain kind of pseudo-conservatism that the United States exists to do good in the world. And with that as our inspiration, we attacked Iraq and we went into Afghanistan, and now we are very, very deeply involved in the war in Ukraine. And I wonder, why is it that we're not spending the same amount of energy thinking about what looks more and more in the United States like a failed state? Now, this is something we used to talk about other states. They don't have a functioning justice system. They are fiscally irresponsible. They can't maintain law and order. Well, that's the United States. The United States is facing enormous problems, but instead of dealing with them and putting financial and other resources into making the best of our own society, we are internationally trying to improve the conditions of people on the other side of the world. There's something of sheer avoidance of reality, or trying to distract Americans from the heart of the problem, which, as far as America is concerned, is right here.
I think you're absolutely right. Now, when it comes to all the foreign aid being delivered, we can look as far as Hunter and Joe Biden receiving $5 million bribes from Ukraine, and that's just the tip of the iceberg in terms of the money that we've seen that they received from Ukraine. And, of course, here we are putting, depending on which estimate you believe, anywhere from $100 to $150 billion into Ukraine. And we've also seen with a lot of foreign aid that gets returned to the politicians who voted for it through jobs for their children and other relatives. So Do we need to start bribing our own politicians to keep the money at home?
I think that's already happening. We're living not in the traditional United States with its constitutional regime. We're living increasingly in a plutocratic banana republic, which has prominent features of a police state. Now here, let me mention something that I haven't touched upon, namely that many of the people who have caused problems, not least the forever wars, are people who have spoken in the name of conservatism. They have been neoconservative, which is something very, very different from a traditional believer in the American constitutional system. The American constitutional system put limits on power and recognized the limits of politics. The neoconservative approach has been radically different and has encouraged people, try to inspire them to go crusading in the rest of the world, starting with the Middle East. And this has been, and of course they have, through the Patriot Act and other things, intruded heavily into the traditional freedoms and liberties of America. There's a huge amount of confusion within the so-called conservative ranks, and this needs to be sorted out in order for America to correct its course.
The one Republican president that we've had that seems not to agree with that and doesn't believe we need to be the world's policeman is Donald Trump. Is that one of the reasons there's so much opposition to Donald Trump, even within his own party?
Oh, well, of course it is. And I think the origin of the very strong opposition to Donald Trump, it came from neoconservatives who didn't like the sound of this America First at all, because they were deeply committed to America as pioneering democracy or freedom around the world. People signed, among the people who signed lists to show that they were opposed to Donald Trump, were most of them prominent neoconservatives. At the same time, I should add that Donald Trump was very contradictory in his appointments. That is, he said America first. He opposed the forever wars, but then he appointed a number of people who were not aligned with him on that score at all. I mean, national security advisors and Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, for example, he was not on board with this. And so you have to ask yourself, how did those appointments come about? I think because Trump was not really up on who was who, he got the advice of people who were entirely too friendly with the neocons. And one question you have to ask is if Donald Trump has learned from these mistakes, because they were genuine mistakes. Appointing Bolton, for example, as National Security Advisor.
Yeah, it's funny, when you were speaking, I was thinking of Bolton the whole time. I don't know whether or not we'll ever see Donald Trump in the White House again, but if we do, it will be interesting to see if he makes better choices in terms of his appointments. Claes, that's all the time we have today. I want to thank you for being on the show. The book, again, is entitled The Failure of American Conservatism and the Road Not Taken by Clais Ryn. And I think you're giving us some answers to questions that I see people posing every day on social media. How did we get in this situation? How did we let this happen? When did this start? So I would encourage everyone to go out and grab a copy, I assume wherever good books are sold. And
yes,
thank you again for being on the show. Love to have you back sometime.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Absolutely. Have a great day, sir.
You too.
You've been listening to the Tea Party Power Hour with Mark Gillar.
We all know a guy who only occasionally shaves for big occasions, And it's because that occasional shave really hurts. It's the time of year for big occasions, and yet there he is, suffering with that cheap drugstore razor. Let's help him out. Henson Shaving's line of razors, built with aerospace precision, deliver a smooth shave your dad, brother, and even son can enjoy, eventually. With replacement blades just 10 cents each, you'll buy it once and they'll use it for life. How's that for the perfect gift? Celebrate with 100 free blades on your first purchase, and no subscription headaches. HensonShaving.com/holiday.
Monetizing digital services since 2004. Boosting the entertainment industry by making digital content accessible for everyone. AWG, where innovation meets monetization.